Welcome to the final video that I'm going to do for the rivers revision. Hopefully they've been useful so far. If you want any help on anything else, you've got my email address, or you can leave some comments in the comments below and I can try and help you with other things. This final video is going to be based on what we can do about floods. So we've looked at flood hydrographs and what that means for a river and what that shows. We've looked at why rivers flood, so the human and physical factors. And now we're going to look at what we can actually do about river flooding and what we can build, what we can do in terms of just leaving the river alone. This is very, very, very similar to the coast stuff that you did when you did coastal management. So the hard and soft engineering. So starting off with what we're doing, we need to understand what hard and soft engineering is. So hard engineering in its basic terms is where we as humans engineer something, we build something to try and control the natural processes of a river. So we build walls, we build a channel, we straighten a river. Soft engineering, on the other hand, is where we work with nature and we don't really change much. We work with nature to allow it to do what it does best, but also we manage the effects of that. And I'll get into what that actually means. I'm showing you this table because you need to understand what each of these different schemes are. You also need to understand basically how it works, although you'd probably never be asked in an exam. And also you need to understand the costs and the benefits. The costs in this case are the negatives and the benefits are the positives of each of the schemes. So I'm going to go through them all, so there's 6 in total, and explain the different things. So the first one we're going to start off with is, we're going to look at a few of them together. So if we look at this first few images here, we've got embankments and flood walls. So what they are is basically where we build an artificial embankment or wall next to the river. And the idea of this is to increase the size of the river channel, which means that there's more space for the water to go during a flooding event. But then it means that it's less likely to flood an area. So, for example, you've got a flood wall here, and then you've got an area that is protected because of that flood wall. You've got the embankment here, which has been, it looks like a levee, but it's not. It's basically an artificial levee that's been created normally with concrete or steel underneath to support it. Sometimes it's coated with rocks to prevent erosion. If you think about the River Mersey along the Sale Water Park, they are just full of river embankments that we have created, and they're obviously to reduce the amount of flooding in the Trafford area. The benefits of this is it obviously reduces flooding. It reduces that risk of flooding. Embankments, they can look quite natural as well. They don't look particularly ugly, whereas flood walls can look ugly. So that's kind of a drawback of them. But they are very expensive to put into place. They cost millions of pounds. It takes a long time to do it. And also, it does influence the natural processes of the river. It also means that the river can't meander, so that's kind of a benefit of it. It stops the meandering of the river. But it can cause problems because the river channel can silt up, which means it can get lots and lots of material that just deposits on the bottom, and therefore it isn't ever removed. And so that actually can then reduce the capacity, reduce the amount of space that the river channel can hold, of water it can hold. Straightening meanders is quite a simple thing to understand as well. So straightening meanders is literally you take a meander out. So you dig a trench, a new river, through meanders. And the idea of this is to reduce the amount of water that is affecting that area. So if you've got a straight channel, then you've got less surface area that can flood. So it's only going to flood, either side of this new straight channel. Whereas if it was an old meander, it could flood a much larger area. So it might be the whole of where my cursor is kind of hovering over now. And so it reduces the areas that can flood, which is obviously a good thing. The bad thing with it though is it speeds up the water. Because it speeds up the water and you're not straightening a whole river, it means that further down the river it can cause more flooding problems and more risk of flooding, and also more risk of erosion. Also, by straightening a river, it means you're going to have to put concrete either side, otherwise it's just going to go back to a meander again. And so again, it can influence natural processes. Dams, you've come across many times before. So a dam is a big wall, steel, concrete wall that is built in a river to hold back water. And so the idea of the dam is to hold back water to therefore reduce the amount of water that's going through an area to reduce the risk of flooding downstream. So the top part here is called your reservoir, and then this penstock allows water to go through but at a controlled rate. The benefits of this is it can create hydroelectric power, and a lot of dams do create hydroelectric power, which is obviously a green form of energy. It's clean, it's not going to harm the environment. But the bad thing is it reduces the amount of migration of things like fish. It can also create pollution behind the dam itself. It also, behind the dam here, it will silt up, it will create lots of sediment, which therefore can actually damage the turbines. So there's lots of pros and cons of it. The main ones, obviously, it reduces flooding and it can create electricity. The next thing we're going to look at are flood relief channels. So I've created a new slide for this. Oh, sorry, no, let's go back to dams. So this is the Three Gorges Dam you looked at in Year 9. You can see a massive dam in China on the River Yangtze to try and reduce flooding downstream. So this reduces flooding in Chongqing and also a bit further down into Beijing. So that's the Three Gorges Dam. You can see here it takes up a massive area. This is a satellite image, and the actual reservoir looks like a river, but it actually used to be, the River Yangtze used to be really thin rivers, like you can see on the side. But you can see here it's silted up, it's created really brown, murky water, which causes a problem. That there is the dam going across. And there's another image of it with a massive reservoir behind it. Another problem with reservoirs and dams is it floods the areas behind the dam, which can obviously mean that people have to move. It destroys farmland, it destroys forest, it destroys habitats, which is also an issue. So flood relief channels, you may or may not have seen these. There's not many around around Manchester. There is one that runs through Chorlton. If you ever take the tram from Sale Water Park to Manchester, you can drive, or the tram goes through it. But a flood relief channel is where basically a new channel is created on a river. So you can see it on the image here. So it's created, but at one end where the water flows in, there is a gate, a sluice gate, which means that it stops water going in normally, but it does allow bits of water through. Depending on the conditions. So if there's more water in the normal river, the original river, it'll open up and it'll allow more water through. And the idea is to obviously reduce the amount of water that's in an area and therefore reduce the risk of flooding downstream. The difficulties with it is it creates obviously an additional river that you have to maintain. A lot of these can create habitats though for animals, which is great, but it does have to take place over a number of years, and that can create issues. It's a very time consuming, very expensive project, and that's why there's not many of them in the UK. Going on to soft engineering, so we've looked at the hard engineering and now look at the soft engineering. So hard engineering is all to do with what we can build, how we as humans can use our brains to kind of stop flooding from even happening. Soft engineering isn't stopping flooding, it's reducing the risk of flooding. It's reducing the damage caused by flooding. So the first thing is flood alerts. You see these a lot during the winter when there's lots of rainfall. Mainly, we don't really go above an amber alert, which is just, be aware it's going to happen. The flood warnings and the severe flood warnings, that's where flooding's going to happen. And so we don't, around Manchester, tend to see a lot of these happening. But the really good thing about flood warnings is it's quite cheap to implement. All you need is a team of scientists, or even you just need a few measuring stations along rivers to give data to say, right, there's a risk, and therefore it's quite cheap to maintain. It's quite cheap to import as well. It also doesn't influence the river. It's totally sustainable because we can monitor it, we can change it, and it doesn't change the river, it doesn't damage habitats. Negative thing with it is it isn't always accurate. It's as accurate as it can be, but it can't ever be 100% accurate. And so that can be one of the major issues. And ultimately, people choose whether to follow the warnings or not. And if they don't choose to follow it, then they're still going to be at risk of flooding. The final soft engineering is floodplain zoning. This is quite an interesting way of looking at of how we can stop the damage caused by flooding. Humans build on floodplains. It's natural. We need space to grow things. We need space to build our buildings. But ultimately, the rivers go into flood. And we can't really complain when it does flood because it's a natural process. But what has started to happen over the past 50 to 60 years is people started to realise, well, if we work with nature, we can actually reduce the risk of flooding and the damage and the cost of flooding. And so floodplain zoning, as you can see on this diagram, is basically where you've got the river. And obviously around the river you've got the floodplain. Well, the floodplain isn't entirely flat. It does have a slope to it. And obviously the higher up the slope you go, the less likely is it's going to flood the higher up you go. And so the idea is that the value of the land increases the further you get from the river. The closer you get to the river, the land value is poor. It's not very expensive land. You're not going to build stuff that's expensive. So for example, right next to the river, you avoid the area because it's most likely to flood. Then a bit further up the slope, you might have pastures for grazing, so farmland. A bit further up the slope, you've got playing fields, because if they flood, well, it's not going to cause major issues. A good example of this is Turn Moss up in Stretford, behind Stretford Grammar, that floods pretty much every year, but in reality it's not damaging anyone's business because it's just a playing field. A bit further up that, you've got car parks and roads, because again, if they're flooded, it's not the end of the world. You can divert roads, people just don't park on that car park. A bit further up is industry, because again, a lot of industry, if it is flooded, you can easily repair it. If it's a workshop, you can just put stuff on tables, for example. If it's a factory, they can move the production elsewhere. But again, it's less likely to flood because you're further away and further up the slope. And then finally, the most expensive thing is housing. So we put that right at the top of the slope because it's less likely to flood up there. So floodplain zoning, real benefits are that, it's obviously cheap to implement. You don't really have to do much apart from plan. But the negatives of it are that, again, it's not 100% accurate. If you get a really, really extreme flood that it hasn't taken into account, it can cause flooding in areas that you don't want to flood. So those are all of the different hard and soft engineering strategies. Again, your revision guide really, really takes this to the next level and explains it very clearly, but in very, very succinct and brief points. So I'd recommend you go there. Seneca also does a very, very good course on this, as does BBC Bitesize. That's the final video. If you want any more videos, please put your comments below in the chat or email me and we can see what we can do about it. Okay, good luck and see you soon.